We've all heard of the classic American dream. If you work hard enough, you can achieve anything, no matter who you are. But this wasn't always the status quo. Sometimes we forget about the people of the past who fought to form this belief. Go back to the 19th century when travelers headed west on a grueling mission that promised anything but comfort. Today we have picket fences, minivans, and golden retrievers. Back then, the American dream was fueled by the Oregon Trail, wagon trains, and the promise of striking gold. Author Winifred Gallagher highlights the women of this time in her book, New Women in the Old West, From Settlers to Suffragists, An Untold American Story. Gallagher says gold and the possibility of a better life drove hundreds of thousands to relocate west almost 2 centuries ago.
In the magic year of 1848, which was actually when the famous Seneca Falls Suffrage Conference was held, the gold rush began in California, and the U.S. annexed the huge Oregon Territory and also took what is now our Southwest as spoils in the Mexican-American War. So the people who were heading out west either wanted to strike it rich in the gold rush or they wanted to claim free land.
And many of these travelers were families coming from the east or upper south regions of the country. While there were some African Americans and Asians in this group, the majority were white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant farmers or artisans. These men and women were used to hard manual labor and today would be considered middle class since they had enough money to migrate out west. Gallagher says that for women of this period, life was difficult and there was some apprehension around what opportunities the rural West would hold.
They really faced a series of childbirths and really backbreaking domestic labor. It was a hard life for most women. That's why so many women were interested in fleeing to the cities. By the same time Western migration was going on, America was urbanizing very rapidly, and life was much easier for women in the cities. They were able to get around. There was transportation, and there were bookstores, and there were newspapers, and shopping was easier, and life in general was a lot easier in urban areas. So on first glance, the women who went west appeared to be going backwards in time to a worse period for women, but in fact they encountered some special advantages once they got to the west.
Most women who did move to this region did so with their husbands. In the 19th and 20th centuries, it was common for teenage girls to be married off at the young age of 14 or 15. In much of the country, they had little independence or say in their day-to-day lives and marriages.
Women's position in larger American society was awful. The women's place was only in the home. They were second-class citizens. They had very few legal rights or economic opportunities. For quote-unquote respectable women, marriage was the only career that was acceptable. And once you were married, a wife could not own property, divorce, have custody of her own children. Women were considered inferior to men in every way except virtue. They had a certain moral authority over matters of right and wrong, and that moral authority was really their only form of power.
But as these women left bustling towns and cities and migrated west, new opportunities took shape in the open prairies they crossed. But how did they start anew in such an unfamiliar place in which some already called home?
You can't really say the West was undeveloped because Native Americans had lived there and, of course, sometimes farmed and traveled and made use of the territory, so it wasn't like it was uninhabited. But the West was very sparsely populated. There were not many people, including Native Americans there. There were no amenities such as shops or churches or schools or anything of that sort. That all had to be built from scratch.
The lack of a functioning society offered some perks. Ladies of the West enjoyed more freedoms than their counterparts out east or in the South. Gallagher highlights that many stepped into leadership roles during this era and were vital in the construction of the first schools, churches, and charities. Women were also outnumbered by single working men. This unequal balance gave those who were there more leverage.
One wife was shocked when she was making breakfast for her family in Gold Rush, California, when a miner passing by offered her $5 for a hot breakfast. That's $168 in today's money. And he noted that he would have paid $10 if she had asked. So women in this environment, single women, had their pick of suitors, and unhappy wives soon availed themselves of America's first divorce mills. California very rapidly became the divorce capital of the nation. Women also benefited from the West's simpler, more experimental settler society. Every pair of hands was needed to get all the work done. No one had time to worry about whether it was man's work or woman's work. And that kind of flexibility enabled women to become more equal by acting more like equals. So these hardworking women were not yet considered equal to men, but they certainly narrowed that gap, and they won men's respect as a force to be reckoned with.
Gallagher says that in heavy mining areas, ladies were such a rarity that towns created new laws that benefited women.
One of my women arrived in Sacramento. There were 6,000 men, and she was one of 3 women. So the Western legislatures wanted to attract more white women. That was one of the reasons why they went for suffrage much earlier. But before suffrage, they tried to lure women with increased property rights and the ability to sue in court and the ability to divorce. They weren't that invested in an unhappy couple staying together for moral reasons. And in an environment where there were so many more men than women, if a woman wasn't happy with a husband who abused her or beat her and her children, she could just leave, and she was not considered a pariah the way a divorcee might be back east. She would very rapidly have her pick of another husband.
In addition to greater freedoms in relationships, women also had more opportunities to get an education from a co-ed school and pursue a career.
One remarkable career opportunity was provided by the government. In 1862, Congress passed the Morrill Land Grant Act, which created about 100 tuition-free public colleges throughout America, but 67 of them, most of them, were in the West. And in the West, most of these schools were coeducational, which was a very radical advance at the time. Indeed, these Western land-grant co-ed schools were some of the first coeducational colleges in the world. So this means that at a time when Eastern girls were going to Vassar and Smith and Wellesley, single-sex schools, the Western women were being educated with men and exchanging views with men and male students, male teachers. Also, now they had a career alternative to marriage. So many graduates became teachers. The West was desperate for teachers. But many others, one of my favorites is Bethenia Owens Adair, who graduated from medical school at the age of 40. She was one of about 15% of Western women who entered traditionally male professions, such as medicine and law, and that's compared to the national rate of 8%. So that's almost twice as many Western women became professionals as women did back east.
Yet, it's important to remember that many women of this era were also homemakers who carried out domestic responsibilities. Gallagher says that this simple way of life contributed to the romanticized stories we tell today.
So this made the kind of idealized the virtuous homemaker in her little cabin with her children and her honest husband out plowing the unplowed ground. So there was a certain amount of romanticism there. But I think it's also important to realize that Western women, the women that I write about, who were the kind of movers and shakers, they did not see themselves as radicals or weirdos or anything like that. They considered themselves mainstream American women who were just taking advantage of the opportunities that the West gave them. They were just doing the work that needed to be done in a very straightforward manner.
Western women of color also pushed for new freedoms as well. Gallagher tells the story of Elizabeth Ensley, an educated African-American woman whose parents were former slaves.
She married a college-educated black man. They both taught at Howard University's normal school. That's a school that teaches teachers how to be teachers. And then they migrated to Colorado, which, like California, was known to be a kind of more liberal-minded state that attracted a number of African-American settlers. And once she got to Colorado, she was a passionate suffragist, and she was, of course, much better educated than most women of any race at the time.
Ensley went on to become the founder and secretary of the Everybody's Equal Suffrage League, during a time when the suffrage movement itself was divided.
This was an integrated suffrage organization at a time when, even within the suffrage movement, a lot of the groups were segregated. So she really made an outstanding difference. She was a political voice in Colorado by the turn of the century.
The strong females of the new frontier banded together to push for more rights within their careers, relationships, and as citizens of the United States. In fact, this population was the first to have the right to vote. They casted ballots years before it was legal for women across the country to vote. Learn more about the stories of these courageous ladies in Gallagher's book, New Women in the Old West, From Settlers to Suffragists, An Untold American Story, available online and in bookstores. You can also find archives of past shows and guests at viewpointsradio.org. Our writer this week is Scarlett O'Hara. Our executive producer is Amira Zaveri. Studio production by Jason Dickey. I'm Marty Peterson.
Viewpoints returns in just a moment.
Cardiovascular or CV disease is the #1 killer of adults in the U.S., and millions of people trying to reduce their risk of a heart attack or stroke may unknowingly be taking medications that are not proven nor FDA approved to reduce cardiovascular risk. Let's hear from cardiologist Dr. John Osborne.
Many people are unaware that after a failed outcome study, the FDA revoked the approval of fenofibrates when added to statins, as the risk outweighed the benefits to heart health. It's important to remember that statins, along with diet and exercise, can lower cardiovascular risk by about 25 to 35%, but persistent cardiovascular risk, which can lead to a life-threatening event, may remain. I would tell anyone still being prescribed fenofibrates, such as Tricor and Trilipix, with a statin, to talk to their doctor about FDA-approved therapies for cardiovascular risk reduction.
To learn more and get clear on the facts, visit itscleartomenow.com. Again, that's itscleartomenow.com.
The number of people with dementia worldwide will nearly triple by the year 2050 to more than 150 million. The new data presented at the Alzheimer's Association International Conference 2021 shows fastest dementia growth in Africa and the Middle East. Dr. Maria Carrillo is Chief Science Officer at the Alzheimer's Association.
Positive trends in education levels are helping to dampen the increase in dementia, but total numbers are still going up because of the aging of the population, as well as the influence of more obesity, diabetes, and sedentary lifestyles that are all risk factors for dementia.
Another study reported at the conference finds wide differences in the Alzheimer's mortality burden in the United States. In the rural South, the Alzheimer's death rate is 3 times higher than the Mid-Atlantic region. Researchers say this could be the result of health disparities, including differing access to primary care and other health services. Find out more at alz.org.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Viewpoints is a production of MediaTrax Communications. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more about upcoming shows and find a library of past programs on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and more information about our guests at viewpointsradio.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Viewpoints. Coming up next week.
I had to learn to do that for myself, too, to give myself some grace and flexibility. I'm normally very hard on myself as an educator.
The lessons learned as students and teachers head back into the classrooms once again. Then,
it's a spectrum like anything. I mean, people try to differentiate low carb and keto, and they're really sort of the same. It depends on how low you keep your carbs and whether you're in ketosis or not.
The conversation around keto. I'm Marty Peterson.
And I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.